The courtroom was a hive of restless murmurs, voices clashing like a storm brewing indoors, until in an instant it all stopped. A chilling hush swept through the space, as if the air itself had frozen mid-breath. Every head turned, every gaze locked onto a tiny figure perched on the witness stand. There sat Emily Thompson, an 8-year-old girl with wide, unblinking eyes, her small frame dwarfed by the towering wooden chair. Her legs dangled above the floor, swaying slightly, too short to reach the edge. In her arms, she cradled a worn-out stuffed bunny, its patchy fur and drooping ears whispering tales of countless nights spent as her silent protector. The lawyer defending her father stood before her, his voice quivering, a fragile thread stretched between astonishment and reverence. "Emily," he said, pausing as if to steady himself against the weight of the moment, "could you please say that again for us?" The little girl tilted her head, her soft brown curls catching the dim light filtering through the courtroom's high windows. Her voice, though quiet, sliced through the stillness with a clarity that belied her age. "I said my daddy didn't do it," she declared, each word steady as a heartbeat. "But I know who did." A shockwave tore through the room. Gasps erupted from the gallery, sharp and jagged like glass shattering against stone. The judge, a stern figure cloaked in black, lurched forward from his perch, his bushy brows knitting together in disbelief. His gavel hovered in midair, trembling slightly as if unsure whether to restore order or let the chaos unfold. Emily's mother, Sarah, sat frozen in the front row, her hands pressed tight against her lips, stifling a sob as tears carved silent rivers down her cheeks. The prosecutor, caught off guard, fumbled with his thick stack of notes, his glasses slipping down his nose as he scrambled to regain his footing. Across the room, at the defendant's table, Matt Thompson, Emily's father, lifted his head. His face, etched with exhaustion and shadowed by dark circles, softened as a faint glimmer of hope flickered in his weary eyes, the first spark of light in months of darkness. The lawyer leaned closer, his tone gentle but urgent, like a man coaxing a secret from the wind. "Emily, can you tell us who it was?" She looked down at her bunny, her small fingers tracing its frayed ear as if drawing courage from its familiar softness. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she raised her head, her gaze sweeping the room with quiet defiance. "I can," she said, her voice a whisper that somehow roared. But before another word could escape her lips, the prosecutor leapt to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is preposterous. A child's testimony can't be taken seriously." The judge's gavel crashed down, a thunderclap that rattled the walls. "Order in the court," he roared, his deep voice booming over the rising tide of whispers. But the tension clung to the air, thick and electric as every soul in the room held their breath, teetering on the edge of what Emily might reveal next. This tiny girl, with her bunny and her unshakable resolve, had just turned a routine trial into a battlefield, and the war was only beginning. Let's rewind the clock a few months back to a time when the Thompson family was just another dot on a quiet suburban map, a slice of ordinary life wrapped in warmth and routine. Picture a cozy little house on a tree-lined street, its faded yellow paint glowing softly under the afternoon sun. Inside, 8-year-old Emily Thompson ruled the roost with her boundless imagination. She was a whirlwind of energy, her laughter bouncing off the walls as she dragged her dad, Matt, into her latest backyard adventure. To her, he was more than a father. He was a superhero in a flannel shirt, always ready with a goofy grin and a playful, "Aye, Captain," to join her pirate quests or dragon hunts at the park. Her mom, Sarah, was the steady heartbeat of the home. A nurse with calloused hands and a gentle smile, she'd come back from long shifts at the hospital, her scrub still carrying the faint scent of antiseptic, and fill the kitchen with the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies. Evenings were sacred. Matt spinning silly stories, Emily giggling over her plate, and Sarah watching them with tired but contented eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a fragile bubble of happiness floating in a world that hadn't yet turned cruel. Then came that fateful summer night, the kind where fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns outside the living room window. Matt tucked Emily into bed, his rough hands smoothing her blanket as he planted a kiss on her forehead. "Sweet dreams, kiddo," he murmured, his voice a comforting rumble. She drifted off, clutching her trusty stuffed bunny, its worn fur soft against her cheek. But hours later, before the first light of dawn could creep through her curtains, chaos shattered the stillness. Emily jolted awake to a nightmare unfolding downstairs. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed through the blinds, casting eerie shadows across her room. She stumbled out of bed, her small feet pounding the floor in her mismatched pajamas, and raced to the stairs. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice cracking with fear. Below, she saw him, Matt, her invincible hero, flanked by stern-faced officers, his wrists bound in cold steel handcuffs. His eyes met hers, wide with panic, but he couldn't speak before they pulled him out the door. Sarah lunged forward, wrapping her arms around Emily to shield her from the sight. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "It's going to be okay." But the lie hung heavy between them. Nothing was okay. Matt had been accused of something unthinkable, attacking their neighbor, Mr. Richards, and leaving him clinging to life. The evidence was brutal. Witnesses swore they'd seen Matt fleeing the scene, his fingerprints marked the back door, and his wallet lay abandoned near the crumpled victim. He pleaded his innocence, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I didn't do it, I swear." But the world turned deaf. The aftermath was a slow unraveling. Friends who once waved across the fence now crossed the street to avoid them. Whispers trailed Sarah and Emily like shadows. Cruel, cutting rumors that painted Matt as a monster. At school, Emily's classmates shunned her, their parents hushed warnings, turning her into an outcast overnight. Sarah fought to hold it together, taking double shifts to scrape together legal fees, her face growing gaunt with worry. And Emily? She hid her tears behind brave smiles, clutching her bunny each night as she listened to her mom's muffled sobs through the thin walls. Their little bubble had burst, and the shards of their old life cut deeper with every passing day. Emily Thompson wasn't the kind of kid to let the world crumble around her without a fight. Even as her family's life unraveled, her dad behind bars, her mom drowning in exhaustion, something fierce flickered inside her small chest. She couldn't fix everything, but she could try. And it all started on a crisp afternoon, the kind where the wind carried whispers of autumn through the backyard. Emily, barefoot in the grass, was lost in a game of pretend with her bunny when voices drifted over the rickety wooden fence. She froze, crouching low behind a tangle of bushes, her heart thumping like a drum. Two police officers stood just beyond the barrier, their badges glinting in the fading sunlight. "This case feels off," one muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "Same neighborhood, same break-in patterns, months of it, but no arrests until now. Those fingerprints? Too neat. What if we've got the wrong guy?" The other officer shrugged, kicking at a pebble. "Maybe, but the DA's got enough to nail Thompson. That's what counts." Emily's breath caught. She clutched her bunny tighter, its floppy ears brushing her chin as her mind raced. Wrong guy? Break-ins? She bolted inside, her small feet leaving muddy prints across the kitchen floor. "Mom," she called, bursting into the living room where Sarah sat, head in her hands. "I heard something about Dad. The police said—" "Not now, honey," Sarah cut in, her voice heavy with fatigue, her fingers pressing hard against her temples. "I can't. Just go play, okay?" Defeated, Emily trudged back to her room, the weight of dismissal sinking into her bones. But that night, under the soft glow of her bedside lamp, she made a choice. If no one else would listen, she'd find the truth herself. She didn't know much about trials or evidence, those were grown-up things, but she knew her dad's heart, and it wasn't the heart of a criminal. Tucking her bunny under her arm, she whispered, "We'll figure it out together." The weeks that followed turned Emily into a pint-sized detective. She became a shadow in her own home, ears perked for every snippet of adult conversation. At the grocery store, she'd linger near gossiping neighbors, her innocent face hiding a sharp mind soaking up every word. In her little pink diary, she scribbled notes, dates, names, anything that might mean something. "Mr. R argued with Mr. B about money," she wrote in wobbly letters, recalling a shouting match she'd glimpsed through her window. "Mr. B sneaky at night, saw him by the shed." One daring afternoon, she even trailed her mom to the lawyer's office. While Sarah argued fees in the next room, Emily slipped past the receptionist with a mumbled, "I need the bathroom," and darted to the cluttered desk. Her eyes scanned a file left open. Photos of the crime scene. A report about Mr. Richards. A line jumped out. Victim had disputes with multiple neighbors. Her pulse quickened. Disputes? Like with Mr. Baldwin, the grumpy old man who always glared at her dad? She couldn't prove it, not yet. She was just a kid with a hunch and a bunny, but then, one restless evening, inspiration struck. Flipping through TV channels while Sarah worked late, Emily landed on a courtroom show. On screen, a young witness stepped up, voice trembling but firm, spilling a truth that turned the case upside down. The lawyer's words echoed, "Even the tiniest spark can light up the dark." Emily's eyes widened, her small hands gripping her bunny so tight its stuffing creaked. "That's it," she whispered. "I can be that spark." From that moment, her mission crystallized. She didn't need to be big or loud, she just needed to be brave. Armed with her diary and a stubborn belief in her dad, Emily set out to uncover what no one else would see. The courtroom was waiting, and she was ready to make it listen. The courtroom loomed like a giant's lair in Emily Thompson's young eyes, but she wasn't about to let it swallow her whole. From the moment her dad's trial began, she'd begged her mom to let her be there. "Please, Mom," she'd pleaded, her small hands tugging at Sarah's sleeve, her voice a mix of desperation and steel. "I have to see him." Sarah's heart twisted. She didn't want her little girl anywhere near the cold, unforgiving chaos of the legal system, but Emily's resolve was a force of its own. Reluctantly, she gave in, and so there Emily sat, tucked in the back row, her bunny nestled under her arm like a shield against the storm. The trial was a relentless grind. Day after day, the prosecutor painted Matt Thompson as a man unhinged, a ticking bomb who'd snapped and left their neighbor, Mr. Richards, fighting for his life. Witnesses marched to the stand, their words stacking bricks in a wall of guilt around her dad, each one a blow to Emily's fragile hope. She watched her father slump lower at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of accusation, his eyes hollow with despair. Her fingers tightened around her bunny's worn fur, her chest aching as doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if he couldn't be saved? But then, on the third day, fate handed her a lifeline. During a tense break in the proceedings, Emily lingered near the hallway, her small frame blending into the bustle of suits and briefcases. She caught a snatch of the prosecutor's voice, sharp and low over a phone call. The security camera's a dead end, smashed before it could catch anything solid. Her heart jolted. Smashed? She flashed back to a fleeting memory. Days before the attack, she'd seen Mr. Baldwin, that sour-faced neighbor with the perpetual scowl, hunched near the Richards house, tools glinting in his hands as he fiddled with something near the porch. She'd told her mom about it, but Sarah had brushed it off. "Just nonsense, sweetie." Now it clicked. That was the camera. She darted through the crowd, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, until she reached her dad's lawyer, Mr. Grayson. Tugging his sleeve with all her might, she whispered, her voice a fierce little spark, "I need to talk. I know something big." Grayson hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who stood nearby with a bewildered frown. But one look at Emily's blazing eyes, and he nodded. "All right, kid," he said softly. "Let's get you up there." Minutes later, Emily climbed onto the witness stand, her knees wobbling but her spirit unbowed. The chair dwarfed her, its hard edges pressing into her back as she settled in, bunny cradled tight. The room's eyes bore into her, some curious, some skeptical, but she held her ground. Grayson approached, his voice gentle but firm. "Emily, tell us what you told me." She took a shaky breath, her gaze sweeping the sea of faces until it landed on her dad. "My daddy didn't do it," she said, her words ringing out like a bell in the silence. "But I know who did." The courtroom exploded, sharp intakes of breath, muffled cries, a ripple of shock that shook the air. She pointed a trembling finger toward the gallery where Mr. Baldwin sat, his hulking figure stiffening under her stare. "I saw him by Mr. Richards' house," she said, her voice rising with every word. "He was messing with the camera before it broke, and I heard him yell at Mr. Richards. He said, 'You'll regret this.'" A deathly quiet fell, broken only by the creak of the judge's chair as he leaned forward, his stern face etched with intrigue. Mr. Baldwin's ruddy complexion drained to a ghostly white, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead as he shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching the bench. The prosecutor's jaw tightened, but before he could object, Emily's tiny voice had already lit a fuse, and the courtroom was about to catch fire. The courtroom buzzed like a hive on the brink of collapse, the air thick with shock and disbelief after Emily's bold accusation. Her tiny voice had dropped a bombshell, and now every corner of the room simmered with its aftershocks. Judge Whitaker, his grizzled face carved with lines of authority, slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack slicing through the chaos like a lightning bolt. "Order!" he bellowed, his voice a deep rumble that shook the walls. "We'll have order in this court, or I'll clear it out." Emily sat perched on the witness stand, her bunny hug tight against her chest, its frayed ears brushing her chin as she steadied her breathing. Her small frame trembled, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire, locked on Mr. Baldwin across the room. He slumped in the gallery, his broad shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink away from the spotlight she'd thrust upon him. Sweat glistened on his brow, his ruddy cheeks now a sickly gray, betraying a guilt he couldn't hide. Mr. Grayson, her dad's lawyer, stepped forward, his suit rumpled but his demeanor calm. "Your Honor," he said, holding up Emily's little pink diary, its cover scuffed and edges curling from use, "my client's daughter has provided critical information. She's documented what she saw, observations that could turn this case upside down. I request a recess to review this evidence and investigate her claims." The prosecutor shot to his feet, his glasses slipping as he waved a frantic hand. "This is outrageous," he snapped, his voice pitching high with indignation. "We're supposed to halt a trial based on a child's scribbles? She's 8 years old. Her story's a fantasy, not fact." Judge Whitaker's gaze hardened, his bushy brows knitting into a stern line. "Sit down, Mr. Collins," he commanded, his tone icy and unyielding. "I'll decide what holds water here. The court will recess for 2 hours. I want this diary examined and I expect answers." The gavel fell again, a final thud that sent the room into a frenzy of whispers and rustling papers. As the crowd spilled into the hallway, Emily climbed down from the stand, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Sarah rushed to her side, enveloping her in a fierce hug, her hands trembling as she brushed Emily's curls back. "Why didn't you tell me all this sooner?" she whispered, her voice cracking, tears streaking her pale face. "I tried, Mom," Emily said softly, her eyes glistening but steady. "You were so tired all the time, and I wasn't sure it mattered. But when I saw Dad up there, I knew I had to speak." Sarah pulled her closer, guilt and pride warring in her chest as she kissed the top of her daughter's head. "You're so brave, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Nearby, Mr. Baldwin huddled with his lawyer, his voice rising in sharp, angry bursts that echoed down the corridor. Emily couldn't catch every word, but his wild gestures and flushed face sent a shiver through her. She tugged her mom's sleeve, her voice a hushed quiver. "Mom, does he look scared to you?" Sarah glanced over, her jaw tightening as she watched him. "He should be," she murmured, her tone edged with steel. The 2 hours crawled by, each tick of the clock stretching into eternity. When the court reconvened, the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every step back into the room. Grayson approached the bench, his expression grim but resolute. "Your Honor," he said, holding up a report fresh from the investigators, "we've got something. That security camera Emily mentioned, it wasn't just broken, it was deliberately tampered with. And the fingerprints on it, they match Mr. Baldwin's." A gasp rippled through the gallery, sharp and electric. All eyes swung to Baldwin, who sank deeper into his seat, his hands clenching the armrest until his knuckles whitened. The judge leaned forward, his voice low but piercing. "Mr. Baldwin, you're up next. Take the stand." Baldwin trudged forward, his heavy steps dragging like a man marching to his doom. As he settled into the witness chair, his eyes darted around, avoiding Emily's steady gaze. Grayson didn't waste a moment. "Mr. Baldwin," he began, his tone smooth but relentless, "Emily says she saw you near that camera before the attack. Care to explain?" I was fixing it," Baldwin stammered, his voice hoarse and unsteady, sweat beading on his upper lip. "Just helping a neighbor, that's all." "Fixing it?" Grayson pressed, his eyebrow arching with mock curiosity. "Funny, because the evidence says it was smashed, not repaired, and those fingerprints, yours, tell a different story." Baldwin opened his mouth, then shut it, his face crumpling as the weight of the truth closed in. Finally, he slumped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him. It was an accident. We argued. He owed me money, and I just wanted to scare him. Things got out of hand." The room erupted, a tidal wave of shock crashing over the benches. Sarah clutched Emily's hand, her breath hitching as tears spilled anew. Grayson gave Emily a small, grateful nod. But as the chaos swirled, Emily's eyes caught something unsettling. The prosecutor whispering urgently with Baldwin's lawyer, their heads bent close, faces tight with unease. A cold knot twisted in her stomach. Baldwin had cracked, but was this the whole story? Something told her the shadows still held more secrets, and they weren't done with her family yet. The courtroom still buzzed with the echo of Mr. Baldwin's confession, a raw, jagged truth that had ripped through the air like a thunderclap. Emily Thompson sat nestled against her mom, Sarah, her bunny pressed tight to her chest as relief washed over her in waves. Her dad, Matt, wasn't the monster they'd painted him to be. Baldwin's own words had shattered that lie, but even as the weight of that victory settled, a shadow lingered, dark and restless, whispering that the storm wasn't over. Days later, the Thompson house glowed with a fragile hope. Sarah bustled in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and the scent of simmering stew, a quiet promise of better times. Emily perched at the table, her small hands flipping through her diary, tracing the scribbled victories that had brought them this far. The phone's shrill ring sliced through the calm, and Sarah snatched it up, her movements quick but steady. "Hello?" she said, her voice bright until it wasn't. Her face drained of color, her knuckles whitening around the receiver as a muffled voice crackled through. "Who is this?" she demanded, her tone rising with a tremor. "What do you want?" Emily's head snapped up, her heart thudding as she watched her mom's composure fracture. Sarah's breath hitched, and with a shaky slam, she dropped the phone back onto its cradle, her whole body quivering. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her voice small but urgent. "Who was it?" Sarah turned, her eyes wide with a fear Emily hadn't seen since the night her dad was taken. "It was him," she said, her words barely audible as if speaking them might summon the threat closer. "Frank Mitchell, he said he's watching us." The room tilted, the warmth of their fragile peace snuffed out like a candle in a gale. Sarah dialed the police with trembling fingers, her voice a tight knot of panic as she relayed the call. Within minutes, the street outside flickered with red and blue, the familiar haunting pulse of patrol cars. Officers swept through the house, their boots thudding against the hardwood, their radios crackling with urgency. Emily clung to her bunny, peering through the blinds as shadows moved in the yard, searching for a ghost they couldn't yet catch. Hours ticked by, the night stretching taut with tension. Sarah paced, her hands wringing a dishcloth into knots, while Emily curled up on the couch, her mind racing. She'd thought Baldwin's confession was the end, proof her dad was innocent, a key to set him free. But Mitchell's voice on that phone twisted everything. Who was he, and why was he watching? Just before dawn, the answer crashed through their fragile sanctuary. A sharp shatter of glass jolted Emily awake, her heart leaping into her throat as she bolted upright. Footsteps thundered through the house, shouts erupting like gunfire in the dark. "Mom!" she screamed, scrambling out of bed, her bunny tumbling to the floor. She flung open her door to a chaos she'd never imagined. Two officers wrestling a hooded figure to the ground in the hallway, his snarling protests muffled by their grip. Sarah yanked Emily back, her arms a steel cage around her daughter as more police swarmed in, flashlights slicing through the gloom. The man thrashed, his hoodie slipping just enough to reveal a face etched with fury. Frank Mitchell. Emily's blood ran cold as his eyes locked onto hers, a venomous glare that pierced the shadows. "It's not over," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice as the officers hauled him up, snapping cuffs around his wrists. "This isn't over!" The police dragged him out, his threats fading into the night, but the chill of his words lingered, seeping into Emily's bones. Sarah sank to the floor, pulling Emily close, her sobs muffled against her daughter's hair. "You're okay," she whispered, more to herself than to Emily. "We're okay." But Emily wasn't so sure. As the house buzzed with officers, dusting for prints, sealing the broken window, she sat silent, her mind a whirlpool of questions. Mitchell's arrest was a win, a monster caught in the act, but his final snarl echoed like a warning shot. The police found traces of someone else's DNA in Baldwin's home. Could Mitchell be the missing piece? And if he was, what else was he hiding? Emily gripped her bunny tighter, her small jaw set with a determination that belied her years. She'd brought them this far, and she wasn't about to let the shadows win now. The air in the Thompson house hung heavy with a bittersweet calm after Frank Mitchell's arrest, but the scars of the night still lingered. Shattered glass swept away, yet the echoes of his threats reverberated in every corner. Emily Thompson sat at the kitchen table, her bunny resting beside her, its worn fur a quiet testament to the battles she'd fought. Across from her, Sarah stirred a pot of soup, her movements deliberate but weary, as if cooking could stitch their frayed lives back together. For the first time in months, a flicker of peace dared to take root, but it was fragile, a candle flame trembling in a draft. That peace erupted into pure joy 2 weeks later. After Baldwin's confession and Mitchell's capture, the evidence piled up like bricks in a fortress of truth. Matt Thompson's charges were officially dropped, the weight of a wrongful accusation lifted at last. Emily and Sarah stood outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. Emily's small hands clutched her bunny, her heart pounding with a hope so big it threatened to burst. When the doors swung open and Matt stepped out, his face gaunt but his eyes alight with relief, Emily couldn't hold back. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice a bright arrow cutting through the stillness, and she ran to him, her sneakers slapping the pavement. Matt dropped the small bag he carried and scooped her up, his arms trembling as he crushed her against his chest. "Emily," he whispered, his voice thick and breaking, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My brave, brave girl." Sarah joined them, her own tears falling freely as she wrapped her arms around them both, a family reunited in a tangle of sobs and laughter. For a moment, the world melted away. The reporters snapping photos, the onlookers whispering, none of it mattered. They were together again, and that was a victory carved from the ashes of despair. That night, the Thompson kitchen glowed with warmth, the table groaning under plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. The first real meal they'd shared in months. Matt regaled them with tales from jail, his voice light with forced humor. "Turns out I'm a terrible card player, but I can bake a mean loaf of bread now." Emily giggled, her laughter a melody that danced through the room, while Sarah's smile softened, the lines of worry easing from her face. But as the plates emptied, Matt's tone shifted, his eyes settling on Emily with a quiet intensity. "Kiddo," he said, reaching for her hand, "I owe you everything. You believed in me when no one else did. You're the reason I'm sitting here." Emily blushed, ducking her head as warmth flooded her cheeks. "I just knew you didn't do it, Dad," she mumbled, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. "I had to help." "You did more than help," Matt said, his voice swelling with pride. "You turned the tide. You're a hero." Tears pricked Emily's eyes as she leapt from her chair, throwing her arms around him in a hug that felt like it could mend every crack in their world. "I missed you so much," she whispered, and Matt kissed her forehead, his own tears falling. "I missed you too, kiddo, and I promise, no more nightmares like this." But their story didn't end with a quiet homecoming. In the weeks that followed, the Thompsons channeled their ordeal into something bigger. Over dinners and late-night talks, Matt proposed an idea. What if we helped others caught in the same mess? People who don't have an Emily to fight for them. Sarah's eyes lit up and Emily beamed, her small voice chiming in. "We could give kids a chance to tell their stories." They named it the Brave Voices Foundation, a beacon for the innocent, a legacy born from their pain. Schools, community centers, even news outlets rallied behind them, and Emily became a quiet symbol of courage, proof that even the smallest hands could shift the scales of justice. Yet as they built this new purpose, a shadow slipped through the cracks. One crisp evening, as the family laughed over a board game, the mail arrived, a plain envelope with no return address. Emily tore it open, her curiosity piqued, only to freeze as she read the single line scrawled inside, "The truth isn't always what it seems." Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she handed it to Matt. Sarah's face paled, and for a moment the room went silent, the weight of those words sinking in like a stone. Emily clutched her bunny, her jaw tightening with a familiar resolve. They'd won their freedom, reclaimed their lives, but this cryptic note was a whisper of something unfinished, a thread still dangling in the dark. The fight wasn't over, and Emily knew it. Whatever came next, she'd face it with the same fire that had brought her dad home. After all, she'd learned one unshakable truth. Even in the quietest moments, the battle for justice never truly ends. And there you have it, folks, an incredible tale that proves heroes don't need capes, just a heart full of grit and a bunny by their side. Emily Thompson started as a little girl lost in a nightmare, but with every step she turned the tables, bringing down the real bad guys and pulling her family back from the edge. From a courtroom showdown to a midnight break-in, this 8-year-old didn't just fight for her dad, she lit a fire that's still burning bright with the Brave Voices Foundation. But hold on tight, because that mysterious letter? It's a curveball that says this story's got more twist up its sleeve. What do you think's coming next? Is there another shadow lurking, or has Emily already conquered it all? Drop your guesses in the comments. I want to hear every wild theory you've got. Did her courage blow you away? Could you stand up like she did? Let's get that conversation rolling. And if you're hooked on this roller coaster of bravery and mystery, smash that subscribe button and tap the bell, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's around the corner. Emily's tale is proof that even the tiniest spark can ignite a revolution, and we're just getting warmed up. Catch you in the next one.